The needle slipped. Blood beaded on her fingertip, bright red against the white silk. 2 hours until she walked down the aisle. 2 hours until Mel Ferrer became her husband. And her wedding dress was destroyed. Audrey Hepburn stood alone in the small stone dressing room of the Bergenstock Chapel, staring at the jagged tear that ran from hip to hem, like a lightning bolt across her future. The dress her mother had spent 6 weeks sewing by hand, working late into the night by lamplight in their tiny London flat, now hung in ruins around her trembling frame. September 25th, 1954. The Swiss Alps stretched endlessly beyond the narrow window, peaks shrouded in morning mist that refused to lift. At 8,000 feet above sea level, the air was thin enough to make breathing difficult, especially when panic was already constricting her chest. The most private wedding Hollywood had ever orchestrated was tucked away in these mountains where no photographers could find them, where no gossip columnists could document every detail, where she could supposedly become Mrs. Ferrer without the world watching. But privacy felt like isolation now. 50 guests waited outside in the alpine air, their voices carrying through the stone walls in muffled waves of anticipation and growing impatience. Among them were some of the biggest names in cinema. Gregory Peck, who'd become like a protective older brother during Roman Holiday. Billy Wilder, who'd already started talking about casting her in future projects. Studio executives whose approval still felt fragile and conditional. And Mel's theater friends from New York, sophisticated people who'd known him for decades, who remembered when Audrey was just another unknown chorus girl hoping for her break. Through the thick chapel walls, she could hear Mel's voice somewhere below, probably in the small anteroom they designated as his preparation space. His tone carried that particular edge of controlled impatience she'd grown to recognize over their 8-month courtship. The same tone he'd used when she'd been late for dinner reservations because she'd gotten lost in script revisions. The same tone when she'd suggested postponing their engagement announcement because she wasn't sure she was ready for the media attention. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was Audrey Hepburn now. Not Audrey Kathleen Rustin, not Etta Van Heemstra, not any of the names she'd worn and discarded like ill-fitting costumes throughout her young life. She was the girl who'd just conquered Broadway in Gigi, who'd stunned the world opposite Gregory Peck in Roman Holiday, who'd graced the cover of Life magazine, and been declared the find of the year by critics who'd never heard her name 6 months earlier. She could have any designer in the world create her wedding dress. Cristobal Balenciaga had sent word, through mutual friends, that he'd be honored to design something for her. Christian Dior's atelier had practically begged her, representative for the commission, and Hubert de Givenchy, the young designer she'd met during her first trip to Paris, had already begun what would become a lifelong collaboration, understanding her aesthetic in ways that felt almost mystical. Instead, she'd chosen her mother's work. Baroness Ella van Heemstra, who'd survived the Nazi occupation of Holland, with a dignity that never wavered even as her world crumbled around her. Who'd watched her teenage daughter dance in underground resistance performances, earning guilders that might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Who'd sold family jewelry piece by precious piece to keep them alive during the hunger winter of 1944. Who'd sewn this dress with hands that had once trembled from malnutrition, working by candlelight because they couldn't afford to waste electricity. Every stitch in this dress carried their history. Every carefully placed seam held memories of nights when they'd huddled together for warmth, when her mother had whispered stories about Audrey's father, the man who'd abandoned them when the war began, who'd chosen Nazi sympathies over his family, the man whose absence had taught Audrey that love could disappear without warning, that promises could be broken as easily as they were made. The tear had happened when she'd caught the hem on the chapel steps, her mind elsewhere, distracted by the magnitude of what she was about to do. Marriage to Mel meant everything would change. No more solo dinners in her tiny apartment on East 71st Street, the first place she'd ever lived alone. No more impulsive trips to Paris to visit Givenchy's atelier, losing herself in discussions of line and proportion. No more being just Audrey, complicated, uncertain, still learning who she was beneath all the roles she'd played. She picked up the needle again, her hand steadier now despite the blood that had dried on her fingertip. Through the small window she could see guests beginning to shift, restlessly in their wooden chairs. Someone had arranged flowers along the stone walls, white roses and baby's breath, simple enough to match the understated ceremony she'd insisted upon. The simplicity had been her idea, a reaction against the Hollywood spectacle that surrounded every aspect of her new life. But now the simplicity felt stark, unforgiving. In a grand cathedral, a torn dress might be lost among elaborate decorations and dramatic lighting. Here, in this intimate space where every detail would be visible, there would be no hiding the imperfection. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Audrey?" Her assistant's voice carried genuine concern. Patricia was new, hired by the studio to manage Audrey's increasingly complex schedule, but she'd proven to be more than just efficient. She was kind, discreet, the sort of person who anticipated needs before they were spoken. "Everyone's waiting, dear. The minister's beginning to look concerned." "5 more minutes," Audrey called back, her voice carrying the theatrical training that allowed her to project calm even when her heart was racing. It was the same voice that had gotten her through her first screen test, through countless auditions where she'd been told she was too tall, too thin, too unusual looking for conventional leading lady roles. She heard Patricia's footsteps retreat, followed by hushed voices as she undoubtedly relayed the message to whoever was growing impatient. Probably Mel's theater friend Jerome, who'd flown in from New York and had opinions about everything. Possibly her own agent, who saw this wedding as a carefully orchestrated publicity opportunity, even though they'd banned photographers from the event. Audrey began to examine the tear more carefully. It wasn't just a simple rip that could be quickly mended. The delicate silk had caught on a rough stone and pulled in multiple directions, creating a complex web of damage that would require careful, time-consuming repair. The kind of meticulous work her mother had taught her during those long war years when making do and mending had been survival skills. She remembered those lessons now, sitting cross-legged on the floor of their Amsterdam hiding place while her mother showed her how to make invisible repairs to clothing that had to last indefinitely. How to strengthen weak spots before they became tears. How to match thread so precisely that no one would ever know fabric had been damaged. "Waste nothing," her mother had whispered during those lessons. "Respect what you have. Make it beautiful again." But there was another voice in her head now, one that had grown stronger during her months with Mel. His voice, explaining why certain things were more important than others, why schedules mattered more than perfection, why keeping important people waiting was unprofessional regardless of the circumstances. "You have to learn to prioritize, darling," he'd told her just last week when she'd been late for a dinner party because she'd spent an extra hour working with the dialect coach on her next film. "Your career is important, but there are larger considerations now. People depend on us being where we said we'd be." The words had stung because they carried truth. She was learning to navigate a world where every choice had consequences, where her decisions affected not just herself, but agents, studios, publicity departments, and now a husband whose own career intersected with hers in ways that were still being negotiated. Another knock, more urgent this time. "Miss Hepburn?" An unfamiliar voice, probably the minister's assistant. "I'm afraid the minister has another ceremony scheduled this afternoon. If we could possibly—" "I understand. Just a few more minutes, please." The pressure was mounting. She could feel it like the thin alpine air, making everything more difficult. Through the walls, she heard someone, it sounded like Mel's mother, suggesting that perhaps they should just proceed and hope for the best. "No one will notice a little flaw," the voice said. Not with how radiant she always looks, but Audrey would notice. And more importantly, her mother would notice when she saw the wedding photographs. Baroness Ella, who was too ill to travel to Switzerland, but who would scrutinize every image for evidence that her weeks of careful work had been worthwhile, who had declined offers of financial help from Audrey's new Hollywood earnings because she insisted on contributing something meaningful to her daughter's wedding day. The dress represented more than maternal love. It was proof that they had survived everything: the war, the poverty, the years of uncertainty. It was evidence that beauty could emerge from hardship, that something precious could be created even when resources were scarce and the future was unclear. Audrey spread the fabric across the small table beneath the window, positioning it to catch the maximum natural light. The tear looked even worse when illuminated clearly, the damaged threads catching the pale morning sun like accusations. She could walk down the aisle with the tear hidden behind her bouquet. The white roses were large enough to conceal most of it, and her train would cover the rest. No one would see it during the ceremony itself. By the time they reached the reception, when photographs would be taken and guests would have opportunities to examine details, it wouldn't matter. The marriage would be accomplished, the commitment made public, or she could tell the truth. Admit that something important was broken and needed proper attention. Acknowledge that some repairs couldn't be rushed, regardless of who was waiting or what inconvenience might result. The needle felt heavier in her hand as she contemplated the choice. This wasn't really about the dress, she realized. This was about everything the dress represented. The difference between making do and making it right. The difference between hiding problems and addressing them directly. Outside, Mel's voice had grown more audible, though she couldn't make out individual words. The tone was unmistakable, though, the controlled frustration of a man accustomed to having things proceed according to his schedule. She'd seen that expression before during their courtship whenever circumstances didn't align with his expectations. There had been the evening when she'd had to cancel dinner because of a last-minute script conference. He'd been understanding, but she'd caught the flash of irritation before he'd composed himself. The afternoon when she'd suggested they postpone their engagement announcement by a week because she'd felt overwhelmed by the media attention her career was attracting. Again, understanding words, but that tightening around his eyes that suggested her timing was inconvenient. He loved her, she was certain of that. But he loved the version of her that fit smoothly into his world, that enhanced, rather than complicated, his carefully ordered life. The Audrey Hepburn who looked perfect on his arm at premieres and dinner parties. The rising star whose career reflected well on his judgment and taste. She wasn't sure he knew the Audrey who had panic attacks about performing, who sometimes couldn't sleep because she worried she was a fraud who'd somehow fooled everyone into thinking she had talent. The Audrey who sent most of her earnings to her mother and felt guilty about keeping enough for herself to live comfortably. The Audrey who was terrified that her success was a fluke that could disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. The real question wasn't whether she should repair the dress. The question was whether she wanted to be the kind of wife who hid problems to avoid inconveniencing her husband, or the kind who insisted on addressing them properly regardless of the cost in time and patience. Audrey picked up the needle and began to work. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the methodical precision her mother had taught her. Each stitch deliberate and carefully placed. Each movement economical but thorough. The kind of repair that would be invisible when completed, that would make the dress stronger than it had been before the damage occurred. As she worked, the voices outside grew quieter, as if people were beginning to understand that whatever was happening in the dressing room required patience rather than pressure. She heard Patricia's voice, calm and diplomatic, probably explaining that everything was fine, that they should just allow a few more minutes for final preparations. The repair took 25 minutes. When she finally held the dress up to examine her work, the tear had vanished completely. The silk fell in perfect lines, just as her mother had intended. Only someone looking for evidence of damage would have any idea that it had ever been imperfect. Audrey slipped the dress back on and stood before the small mirror. She looked exactly as she had when she'd first entered the room, except for something subtle in her expression. Something calmer and more resolved, as if she had settled a question that had been troubling her for longer than just the duration of the morning. She opened the door to find Patricia waiting anxiously in the narrow hallway. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," Audrey said, and meant it. The walk down the aisle felt different than she'd imagined it would during all her nervous rehearsals of this moment. She moved slowly, not from ceremony but from certainty. Each step deliberate, each breath measured. Mel stood at the altar, his face initially tight with barely controlled impatience. But as she approached, she watched his expression change, saw him register how she looked, not just beautiful but somehow more present than she'd seemed all morning, more herself. The ceremony proceeded without further incident. They spoke their vows in voices that carried clearly through the small space. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss felt both like a beginning and like an answer to a question she hadn't known she'd been asking. Later, during the reception, as guests commented on how perfectly everything had gone, how radiant she looked, how beautifully her dress fit her, Audrey touched the place where the tear had been. Only she knew it was there. This small proof that sometimes the most important work happens in private, when you're alone with yourself and forced to choose between what's convenient and what's right. The marriage would last 14 years, long enough for her to learn that love requiring you to hide parts of yourself isn't really love at all. Long enough to understand what her mother had really sewn into that dress. Not just beauty, but the knowledge that some things are worth the time it takes to repair them properly. And some things, once broken, teach you more about yourself than they ever did when they ever did. We're whole.